Hi, and welcome to the lecture on labeling theory.
Let's talk for a minute about what labeling theory is. Labeling theory is an individual-level explanation of crime. It states that individuals who have acquired a quote-unquote deviant or criminal or offender master status have altered their social identity in a significant way, and consequently alter their behavior. Due to this status and behavior alteration, offenders also encounter social obstacles that block them, or effectively block them, from the aspects of life that those not labeled deviants are able to access, such as finding work, earning a high school diploma or a college degree, or participating in civic life. In its most superficial form, labeling theory suggests that individuals feel obligated to act out roles dictated to them by their status as criminals. Later, many options are unavailable to such individuals due to their criminal records limiting their professional networks that they are able to build, and thus the jobs they're able to get. It also limits the people who are willing to become their friends, the housing they're able to rent or find, and in many cases, even how willing their families are to associate with them. The theory holds that ideas about the self affect recidivism rates then. In research, the relationship between identifying oneself as a deviant and committing deviant behavior has a very high correlation, which lends some credence to labeling theory. However, this correlation may be due to the relationship between identity and behavior being mediated by other social influences. Think of all the ways a criminal record can affect your life, or would affect your life, especially if you had a criminal record that came with a significant label, like that of being a child sex offender or a drug dealer. Your probation, or terms of release after your first offense, would likely bar you from jobs associated with or near to children if you were a child sex offender, or children and drugs if you were a drug dealer. You would also have to quote-unquote check the box in many states on employment applications that ask if you've ever been arrested or convicted of a crime, making it exceedingly unlikely that you would be able to find a job in the formal labor market. Consequently, you might turn to the informal labor market for work. And although the informal labor market does contain some jobs that are legitimate, like being a babysitter, a day laborer, or a gardener, most frequently, felons who end up in the informal labor market do so by taking an illegitimate job, such as one associated with drugs or racketeering or other illegal activities. The criminal record may mean you were banned from seeing your own children or picking them up at school even. It also may prevent you from hanging out with other children in your extended family. This also may complicate your ability to find housing. Since many housing applications ask if you have a criminal record, it may be difficult to find a place to rent. And if your family has children living with them and you are unable to live with minors, you would be unable to live with your family. So many times for such individuals, they end up living in a motel where the weekly rental rates would be quite high, frequently 2 to 3 times that of the cost of an apartment, or perhaps on the street or an abandoned house. It would be unlikely that you went to college if you found yourself in this position, but if you wanted to go now, it would be very difficult, as your criminal record would make you ineligible for federal student loans. Furthermore, your ability to have a social life would be limited, and the adults with whom you would be most likely to interact would be those with whom you would live in a motel or a house, and those with whom you work. Since both populations would be likely to contain other ex-offenders, you may be violating the terms of your release by doing so, leading you to get in even more trouble. Labeling theory says that this additional trouble would be because of your deviant status, the informal social sanctions that you had experienced, and the formal social sanctions, like checking the boxes on applications that say you have a criminal history, would reinforce your label. or your identity as a deviant. Consequently, you might reject your beliefs in conforming to the norms of greater society and purposefully seek out deviant friends, or at least other friends who label themselves as deviants like you. Since these friends would feel less judgmental and would be willing to offer you social support or friendship, with these new deviant friends, you would become or start part of a subculture that approves of or condones deviance. This culture is likely to lead to further criminal behavior on your part and on the parts of other members of this culture, as you all have each other to support your criminal lifestyles. There are norms in your subculture that encourage or at least look the other way towards crime, and you have few relationships in the culture at large to maintain. Furthermore, you may need to commit crime in order to survive, in order to pay your bills, as you have the inability to access traditional legal methods of earning income. This would be happening to everyone, or most everyone, who is part of your subculture. Lamert said that there is a specific sequence of events leading to becoming a secondary deviant. This sequence of events is as follows. 1, that you become a primary deviant, which most of us are. Most of us are deviant in some way. Second, that primary deviant actions lead to social penalties. All right. Third, those penalties then lead to more primary deviation. All right. So if somebody tried drugs, they were caught trying drugs, they had a minor sentence put on them, or were arrested, but then felt social shame for it, causing them to do more drugs. That's an example of the first 3 steps. Those first 3 steps lead to stronger penalties and rejection by society. So if doing drugs twice meant that you were caught both times, or you've been caught, then the next time that you're caught, you face even stronger penalties, which leads to you being rejected by society. This rejection by society leads to further deviation, which then leads to what we call a crisis in the community's ability to tolerate a person. And that crisis leads to further stigmatization, and the process or the label of deviant is really applied. After the process or the label has been applied, individuals strengthen their deviant conduct, which leads to the individual accepting the label of being a deviant. During this process, and at the end of this process, once the individual accepts the label of deviant, it limits the options of conventional employment pretty significantly, and in many times permanently. It also causes individuals to interact with more deviants. From research, we know that labeling theory is particularly useful when examining juveniles and delinquent youths. Because of the transition from youth to adulthood being largely a process of conforming and developing one's social identity, being stigmatized as an outsider or deviant early in life can have very serious long-term implications. Does entering the justice system at a young age increase the likelihood of an individual becoming a quote-unquote career offender? How does labeling affect a juvenile selection of friends? When societies say they're going to quote-unquote crack down on crime, what effect does this have on youth? These are all questions that come out of labeling theory. As you've read about, there have been many studies of labeling theory, not just in criminal justice. Rosenham's 1973 study looked at the label of mentally ill being placed on people, and found that even if people were not mentally ill and just acting normal in a mental institution, medical professionals interpreted their behavior as part of their illness. The study participants were hospitalized for an average of 19 days for an initial complaint associated with mental illness, but exhibited normal behavior once they were inside the mental institution in Rosenham's study. This suggests that once a person is labeled, that label can be hard to shed. Normal behavior is overlooked or relabeled as abnormal because labels are powerful. In a study by Mutapa in 2010, he examined the behaviors and attitudes of 91 incarcerated youth in a detention camp in Southern California. He linked serious alcohol abuse with a shared social identity and the quote-unquote gang member image. Participants were asked in a self-report survey about their behaviors prior to their detention, as well as their experiences leading up to and during detention with feelings of anger. They were also asked to select from a list of 16 different social quote-unquote identities, the ones that they felt that best represented their peer group. The list was compiled by researchers and detention camp staff. The list included, but was not limited to, identities such as skaters, stoners, jocks, taggers, heavy metalers, loners, and actors. What researchers in this study found was that the majority of participants who identified themselves as quote-unquote gang members, and 63% had consumed alcohol heavily in the 30 days prior to their incarceration. Those who had not identified as gang members, of those who had not identified as gang members, only 30% had consumed alcohol in the days prior to incarceration. The results remain statistically significant, after controlling for self-reported levels of anger. So although the study did not account for the possibility that offenders' self-concept may be the result of their incarceration, it did take steps towards clarifying the relationships among individuals' identities, peer groups, and behavior. This was especially detrimental to the life course orientation of juveniles when developing their concepts of self. It also followed that these offenders were the ones who underwent the greatest change in status, and that they may consequently undergo the greatest change in their behavior. Another important study of labeling theory was the one done by Chiricos et al. In 2007. He observed in this study that followed 71,548 men and 24,371 women who were convicted of felonies in Florida between 2000 and 2002. At the time, Florida law granted judges discretion over the decision on whether or not to withhold the legal status of felon for someone who was convicted of the felony. Having the status withheld meant for the individual that they did not need to report their conviction on applications for employment, that they retained their ability and eligibility for government programs, including federal student financial aid, and that they did not have their voting rights curtailed or revoked. So in theory, this preserves some measure of the convict's stakes in conformity and incentives to avoid further deviant behavior. The researchers found that among offenders convicted of a felony, women, whites, and those with greater educational attainment, and those without a prior record were most likely to be affected by their felony status, compared to those who had had the status withheld. This was measured in terms of increased recidivism. So those who were most likely to reoffend were those who were women, whites, those who were better educated, and those without a prior criminal record when they had a label of felon applied to them. Contrary to some initial expectations that these groups should be the most able to insulate themselves from the effects of criminal labeling, this data points to the fact that these groups are in fact those least likely to isolate themselves after being labeled as criminals. Or you can say that those who have more to lose from a criminal conviction lose more. And it may not be the conviction that is actually what causes them to lose. It's the label associated with the conviction, according to labeling theory. In another study by Myers in 2003, he looked at 494 youths convicted of violent crime in Pennsylvania. Some of these youths were waived into adult courts. 79 of them were actually waived into adult courts. Statistical controls were in place for prior age, prior record, whether or not a weapon was used to commit the crime, the location of the crime, parents' marital status, and school enrollment. Well, the group that was waived into adult court was roughly 50% more likely to be rearrested for violent felonies in the follow-up period. The controls that were in place cannot completely account for risks of selection bias, but still 50% greater likelihood is pretty significant. The waived offenders on average should have more extensive prior records than the youths that were tried in juvenile court. However, the study revealed an interesting correlation that accords with the implications of the Chirico study mentioned in the previous slide. Offenders who had obtained a diploma or GED before their initial arrest, or who were enrolled at school at the time of their initial arrest, were significantly more likely to reoffend compared to those who had dropped out of school. Myers offers the explanation that perhaps those who had completed their education might have lost employment as a result of their arrest. Additionally, those enrolled in the schools might have elected not to return following their arrest, and thus encountered difficulty in obtaining employment. Next, let's talk about delinquent peer associations. Serious criminal sanctioning may produce social obstacles that discourage investment in conventional societies. Rejection from conventional groups may come in the form of difficulty in obtaining employment, barriers against qualifying for student loans, and informal exclusion from conventional social networks, all of which we discussed previously. Punishment that generally excludes the offender from the majority, whether that punishment is physical or social, such as incarceration, increases the risk of the offender's alienation from society and consequent, quote, rejection of their rejectors, unquote. Incarceration may also fail to adequately prepare released offenders to reintegrate themselves into conventional societies due to ineffective treatment programs or underdeveloped reintegration programs, as you've discussed in your previous classes, I'm sure. In one study, it showed that a significant population of 83 offenders in society allowed for the formation of a deviant subculture. So all it takes essentially is 83 offenders, former offenders, in a community in order for them to create a delinquent subculture or deviant subculture. These deviant subcultures create an environment that is more conducive to recidivism by providing appropriate opportunities, values, and definitions. A 2006 study examined the ensuing criminal elements following juvenile justice system intervention. Using panel data from 873 middle schoolers, from 870 middle schoolers, researchers coded participants' individual delinquency as well as the delinquency of their peers. The study sought to establish a connection between formal justice system intervention and subsequent delinquency. Data was collected 3 times at 6-month intervals, so in other words, in a period of over a year, in face-to-face interviews conducted in private. After controlling for other variables such as race, gender, initial levels of delinquency, family impoverishment, and substance abuse, they found that juvenile justice intervention is significantly associated with serious delinquency in a subsequent period, so meaning that being part of the criminal justice system is likely to lead to more delinquency. Also, because of the longitudinal nature of the study, some evidence was gathered based on the strength of variable influences. According to the results, the association with deviant peers significantly mediated the relationship between formal justice system intervention and delinquency. The authors of the study concluded that deviant groups represent a source of social support in which deviant activities were accepted. Moreover, deviant groups often provided social shelter from those who rejected the individual deviants. The labeled person was thus increasingly likely to become involved in social groups that consisted of social deviants and unconventional others. The idea that labels may cause later deviance is really important to juvenile justice. Movement towards the sentencing of juveniles in adult courts in the hopes of quote-unquote getting tough on crime or quote-unquote holding kids accountable may exacerbate the problem of recidivism among juveniles. Strong labeling that rejects or that results in social rejection is an extreme response on the part of policymakers, and one that is unsupported as an effective method of crime control, i.e., labeling juveniles does not work to reduce crime. As mentioned before, adolescents who develop their identities may be particularly affected by strong stigmatization, and because they are just beginning to develop their stake in societies and conforming along with societal norms, the presentation of serious social obstacles to get back to being considered normal is really problematic, and also leads them to have serious obstacles in finding employment, financing college, accessing conventional social networks, all of which affect the rest of their lives. Rather than discouraging participation in conventional activities by labeling and isolating juvenile offenders, policies should be remedial and foster reintegration following shame. This may happen through academic mentoring, career advising, or providing alternate activities. Um, Lingering questions regarding labeling theory include the following. First, is labeling theory a theory, as it is not testable, at least in many forms, and the studies that do test it show little support for the theory? Second, are the effects of being labeled overprescribed by the theory? Third, labeling theory focuses on the process of criminalization, but our methods for measuring it are cross-sectional, meaning that we do it at one point in time. We take one measurement, typically, of whether or not someone has been labeled a deviant, and there are consequent actions after being labeled that deviant. Some of the studies that I discussed previously tried to get around that problem, but it is a concern for many studies of labeling theory. In short, we need longitudinal data and simultaneous equation modeling techniques in order to accurately measure whether or not labels predate some forms of actions, and to be able to attribute negative actions to the labels themselves. So longitudinal data means that we need to be able to take multiple measurements of the same people over long periods of time. So the study where the same individuals were interviewed over a year-long period, 3 different times, 6 months apart, about their involvement in illegal or illicit activities, is an example of a longitudinal study. Few studies are longitudinal studies, but we need more studies that are in order to adequately test labeling theory. Finally, we need to consider rituals, particularly those that deal with disintegrative shaming, which is likely to cause future deviance. We need to encourage the criminal justice system to engage in reintegrative shaming, which is likely to prevent future deviance from occurring. That's it from this week. I hope you have a good rest of the week.